This is a continuation of the reading of Fool Me Twice, Fighting the Assault on Science in America by Shawn Lawrence Otto. Today, Chapter 5, Give Me Shelter. Now we're all sons of bitches. Kenneth Bainbridge to J. Robert Oppenheimer after the July 16, 1945 atom bomb test. An intellectual weapon. Science took an important leap in America's public consciousness during World War II when it was transformed from an exploration of nature into a means to win the war for democracy. Radar and the atomic bomb had major impacts on the war's outcome, as did sonar, synthetic rubber, and the proximity fuse, and other key wartime innovations, with many of the efforts being led by immigrants from an increasingly anti-science Third Reich. The war didn't start out this way. In fact, during the 1930s, Adolf Hitler was an early adopter of the latest science and technology, which he used to great political advantage. He barnstormed 21 cities by airplane, a first in his 1932 campaign for president against Paul von Hindenburg, an effort the campaign called Hitler über Deutschland. The Nazi Party mounted a relative novelty gramophones on vehicles and used the public's attraction to them to broadcast a uniform political message. Hitler lost the presidential election, but won enough publicity to be named Chancellor in 1933. That year, the Third Reich introduced another weapon with which to spread Nazi ideology. They underwrote the Volksempfänger, or People's Receiver, and offered it to the public at a low cost with great success. It had no international shortwave bands, only domestic, which the government filled with propaganda and patriotic music. The world's first regular television broadcast was instituted in Germany beginning in March 1935 with similar goals, and the Third Reich pioneered the use of the classroom film strip to inculcate uniform Nazi ideas about politics and racial pseudoscience in its students. As Hitler's Minister for Armaments, Albert Speer recounted his trial in Nuremberg after the war, Hitler's dictatorship differed in one fundamental point from all its predecessors in history. It was the first dictatorship in the present period of modern technical development, a dictatorship which made complete use of all technical means for the domination of its own country. Through technical devices like radio and the loudspeaker, 80 million people were deprived of independent thought. Germany also made great strides in mechanized warfare and made key technological advancements to the submarine and ballistic missile. But the intolerance and uniformity of the Nazi regime and the elevation of ideology and propaganda over knowledge and science began to work against the ideals of freedom that lie at the foundation of science. Berlin was the capital of world art, culture, and science in the late 1920s and early 1930s, but the Nazis considered the city's artistic and scientific cross-pollination degenerate. As they elevated rhetoric and ideology over science and tolerance, Germany's intellectuals began to either conform to Nazi ideology or flee. Within a decade, German scientific and technological progress ground to a halt as the Third Reich lost many of its most creative minds to Britain and the United States. Presiding over the American science war effort was Edwin Hubble's boss, Vannevar Bush, an engineer and the president of the Carnegie Institution of Washington. There had been a certain lack of cooperation between the Europe-friendly science enterprise and the military during World War I, and certain administrative barriers to the military's adoption of new technologies that Bush was anxious to prevent the United States from repeating, particularly with the vast influx of talent the country was reaping as a result of growing Nazi intolerance. Albert Einstein was the most famous of these immigrants, but there were many others, most of them Jewish. Bush was strongly of the opinion that science and technology would lead to military superiority for whichever country best exploited them. After the Germans invaded Poland in September 1939, Bush became convinced of the need to establish a federal agency that would coordinate U.S. research efforts. He was able to schedule a hasty meeting in June 1940 with President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who approved the agency in less than 10 minutes. The National Defense Research Committee, NDRC, the forerunner to today's National Science Foundation, was established on June 27th. The Open Society, the wartime Esprit de Corps, the federal dollars, and the pooling and marshaling of the talent organized the American science enterprise into an intellectual weapon unlike any seen before. Under the auspices of this and a related agency, Bush initiated and oversaw the development of the atomic bomb until it was taken over by the military, as well as the development of radar, sonar, and numerous other inventions critical for the war effort, and several significant medical advances, including the mass production of penicillin. The end of innocence. One of the 4 top scientists Bush would appoint to lead the NDRC was Harvard President James B. Conant, whom he initially placed in charge of chemistry and explosives. When the NDRC took on the goal of making an atomic bomb before the Germans could, Conant recruited a former Harvard chemistry major, the charismatic and popular University of California at Berkeley theoretical physics professor J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was recommended by his friend and fellow Berkeley physicist Ernest Lawrence. It was to be physics' finest hour, and Oppenheimer, the poetic son of German Jewish immigrants who read the Bhagavad Gita in Sanskrit and studied philosophy under Alfred North Whitehead, threw himself into the problem with abandon, assembling a crack team of the best minds in physics, including several of his own top students and several European immigrants. In September 1942, the project was turned over to the military under the command of engineer and Brigadier General Leslie Groves. Groves recognized Oppenheimer's brilliance and ambition and appointed him scientific director of the now codenamed Manhattan Engineer Districts, or more simply the Manhattan Projects. The work was without doubt the most concentrated intellectual effort in history. Science was to be America's greatest defense against tyranny in a race against time. But then, in the blink of an eye, everything changed. The project succeeded, and on August 6, 1945, the United States drops the first of two of its new bombs of light, codenamed Little Boy, on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. On August 9th, Fat Man fell on Nagasaki. The bombs proved the power of knowledge once and for all, and Oppenheimer, as the director of the projects, was the first spokesman for the awesome power of science in a new era. After the euphoria of winning the war had ebbed, however, the idea that the United States had used science to kill an estimated 110,000 Japanese civilians without any warning, with another 230,000 dying from radiation injuries over the next 5 years, a side effect the United States at first officially denied, weighed heavily on Oppenheimer's conscience, and it weighed on America's conscience, too. But in addition to moral unease, Oppenheimer, like many other leading scientists, had a mounting concern that the Soviet Union, with its vast uranium deposits, would engage the United States in an arms race. The Allies, and America in particular, had up to this point regarded themselves as fighting the good fight, honorable, fair, and true, with one hand tied behind their backs like Superman. The obliteration of 2 cities of civilians avoided what would surely have been a horrible and bloody invasion against a radicalized nation that was using suicide bombers, but it also exposed the dark side of the power that science could unleash, and the horrific consequences that are possible when ethics lag behind knowledge. Mainstream Americans, who had been largely pro-science during the 1920s and 1930s, now became deeply ambivalent. Was it right, what we had done? Was it honorable? And could it come back to hurt us? Science, and with it America, was growing up, and with the increased power came the dawning of a new age of responsibility. 7 weeks after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki blast, William Lawrence, the New York Times reporter whom the War Department had contracted to be the atomic bomb's official historian, characterized this visceral feeling. The atomic age began at exactly 5:30 Mountain Wartime on the morning of July 16, 1945, on a stretch of semi-desert land about 50 airline miles from Alamogordo, New Mexico, just a few minutes before the dawn of a new day on this earth. And just at that instant there rose from the bowels of the earth a light not of this world, the light of many suns in one. There was a sense that scientists had unlocked a power whose use crossed an ethical boundary, and that this act had somehow soiled science and might even destroy humanity. Oppenheimer, the poet-physicist who thought of a verse from the Bhagavad Gita upon seeing the first atomic detonation at Trinity Test Site in New Mexico, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," spoke of his growing misgivings at the American Philosophical Society in November. "We have made a thing, a most terrible weapon that has altered abruptly and profoundly the nature of the world. We have made a thing that by all the standards of the world we grew up in is an evil thing, and by so doing, by our participation in making it possible to make these things, we have raised again the question of whether science is good for man, of whether it is good to learn about the world, to try to understand it, to try to control it, to help give the world of men increased insight, increased power." Albert Einstein, who had played a key role in alerting President Roosevelt to the possibility of making such a bomb, shared Oppenheimer's feelings. He sent a telegram to hundreds of prominent Americans in May of 1946, asking for $200,000 to fund a national campaign to let the people know that a new type of thinking is essential if mankind is to survive and move toward higher levels. This appeal is sent to you only after long consideration of the immense crisis we face. The telegram contained what has become one of the most famous quotes in science. The unleashed power of the atom has changed everything save our modes of thinking, and we thus drift toward unparalleled catastrophe. Everything has changed save our modes of thinking can speak not only of the bomb, but also of climate change, biodiversity loss and habitat fragmentation, ocean trawling, geoengineering, synthetic biology, genetic modification, chemical pollution, and a host of other science challenges we now face. Science and technology have delivered awesome power to governments and industry, but they have not granted us complete awareness of the potential consequences of this power or mechanisms for its sustained use without causing destruction. We are ever like teenagers being handed the car keys for the first time. After the war, the feeling that our ability with science had outstripped our moral and ethical development as a society, perhaps as a species, was not limited to physicists, but rather was spread across the sciences. The Australian Jewish biochemist Erwin Chargaff immigrated to the United States to escape the Nazis in 1935. His work would lead to James Watson and Francis Crick's discovery of the double helix structure of DNA. Chargaff's autobiography describes his changed feelings about science. The double horror of two Japanese city names, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, grew for me into another kind of double horror, an estranging awareness of what the United States was capable of. The country that 5 years before had given me its citizenship, a nauseating terror at the direction of the natural sciences were going. Never far from an apocalyptic vision of the world, I saw the end of the essence of mankind, an end brought nearer, or even made possible by the profession to which I belonged. In my view, all natural sciences were as one, and if one science could no longer plead innocence, none could. Military leaders shared a similar concern. Omar Bradley, the first chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff and one of the top generals in North Africa and Europe during World War II, gave blunt voice to the cultural angst in a 1948 Armistice Day speech. Our knowledge of science has clearly outstripped our capacity to control it. We have many men of science, but too few men of God. We have grasped the mystery of the atom and rejected the Sermon on the Mount. Man is stumbling blindly through a spiritual darkness while toying with the precarious secrets of life and death. The world has achieved brilliance without wisdom, power without conscience. Ours is a world of nuclear giants and ethical infants. The endless frontier from wonder to fear. In November of 1944, Roosevelt had asked Bush to consider how the Wartime Science Organization might be extended to benefit the country in peacetime, to improve national security, aid research, fight disease, and develop scientific talent of the nation's youth. After the war was won, Bush submitted his report to President Harry S. Truman. Science, the Endless Frontier, made the case that the creation of knowledge is boundless in its potential. The report is widely credited with laying the groundwork for the second golden age of American science, during which the federal government, not wealthy philanthropists, became the principal funder of scientific research in peacetime as well as war. In his report, Bush argued that science was of central importance for freedom, an argument that was powerfully underscored when, in the dog days of August 1949, the Soviet Union detonated an atomic bomb of its own as Oppenheimer had feared it would. America's sense of impending doom over the power scientists had unleashed by splitting the atom turned into a profound fear of a clear and present danger. In less than a year, a bill creating the National Science Foundation, a subject that had been languishing, was signed into law, and science began to undergo a largely unnoticed but profound change in its central relationship to American culture. The grand enterprise that had for 2 centuries been motivated by a sense of wonder on the part of noble idealists and adventurers, wealthy visionaries, and civic-minded philanthropists was now motivated by federal investments propelled by a sense of fear. Duck and cover. It was a fear that would impact the broader American culture for the next 50 years. In the first decade of the Cold War, American defensiveness bordered on hysteria. We knew what a nuclear weapon could do. We'd done it. And now the possibility was very real that it would boomerang back on us. And the horror was that what was at risk was our most precious asset, our children, the baby boom. The Federal Civil Defense Administration determined that the country that would win a nuclear war was the one best prepared to survive the initial attack. Achieving this required a homeland mobilization on an unprecedented scale, and our children needed to know what to do when nuclear war came. They commissioned a 9-minute film called Duck and Cover that showed Bert the turtle pulling into his shell to survive a nuclear explosion that burns everything else. The film exhorted millions of school children to duck and cover like Bert by immediately covering the backs of their heads and necks and ducking under their desks if they saw a bright flash. The film didn't mention that the gamma ray burst, which carries most of the lethal radiation, arrives with the flash. The children were reminded regularly that because a nuclear attack could happen at any time, they, like soldiers in a combat zone, needed to maintain a high level of alertness, forever ready to duck and cover. They did drills in school and participated in citywide mock Soviet atomic bomb attacks. Run like hell. This was terrorism on a new scale. Imagine that Al-Qaeda is in charge of a country the size of the Soviet Union and has nuclear weapons trained on the United States, and you can get a sense of the fear that was driving the nation. We knew what these weapons could do, and we knew that they could be used again. Our only option was to plan for an attack on American soil. This knowledge changed American culture and its relationship to science. For example, it has long been the prevailing opinion that the American suburbs developed as a result of the increased use of the car, GI Bill-funded home construction, and white flight from desegregated schools after the 1954 Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka. But in reality, the trend had started several years before Brown. In 1945, the bulletin of the atomic scientists began advocating for dispersal or defense through decentralization as the only realistic defense against nuclear weapons, and the federal government realized this was an important strategic move. Most city planners agreed, and America adopted a completely new way of life, one that was different from anything that had come before, by directing all new construction away from congested central areas to their outer fringes and suburbs in low-density continuous development, and the prevention of the metropolitan cores further spread by directing new construction into small, widely spaced satellite towns. Nuclear safety measures drove the beginning of the abandonment of our cities. After being told that there is no doubt about it, if you live within a few miles of where one of these bombs strike, you'll die. We can always hope that man will never use such a weapon, but we should also adopt the Boy Scout slogan, be prepared. Getting far enough out of the target city so that the blast might be survivable seemed wise. Those who could afford to left. Those who remained were generally less affluent, and the minorities made up a disproportionate share of the poor. A far worse development for minorities in America came in 1954 when the Federal Atomic Energy Commission realized that with the advent of the vastly more powerful hydrogen bomb, the present national dispersion policy is inadequate in view of existing thermonuclear weapons effects. By then it was too late. The suburbs were growing, but offices were still by and large downtown. A new strategy was needed. President Dwight D. Eisenhower instead promoted a program of rapid evacuation to rural regions. As a civil defense official who served from 1953 to 1957 explained, the focus changed from duck and cover to run like hell. Cities across America ran nuclear attack drills, each involving tens of thousands of residents, practicing clearing hundreds of city blocks in the shortest possible time. It became clear that this would require massive new transportation arteries in and out of cities. The resulting National Interstate and Defense Highways Act of 1956 was the largest public works projects in history. It created a system that provided easier access from the suburbs into cities, as well as a way to more rapidly evacuate cities in case of nuclear war. The new freeways had to be built in a hurry and were naturally routed through the cheapest real estate, which usually meant plowing through richly tapestried and vibrant minority communities, displacing millions. Although poverty had been concentrated in these very neighborhoods, their destruction ripped apart the social fabric of America's uprooted minority communities for years, destroying social support networks and leading to a generation of urban refugees. These accommodations for defense brought an immense change in the fabric of America, altering everything from transportation to land development to race relations to modern energy use and the extraordinary public sums that are spent on building and maintaining roads, creating challenges and burdens that are with us today, all because of science and the bomb. The protection racket. The fear that was changing the nation steps up another notch with the Soviet launch of Sputnik 1, the first Earth-orbiting satellite, on October 4th, 1957. Its diminutive size, about the size of a beach ball, made it perhaps the most profoundly influential 23-inch diameter objects in history. Traveling at roughly 18,000 miles an hour, the shiny little orb circled the planet about once every hour and a half, emitting radio signals that were picked up and followed by amateur radio buffs the world over, but nowhere more closely than the United States. Sputnik shocks America in ways that even the 1949 Soviet nuclear tests had not, because for the first time the commies were not just catching up, they were ahead, and now they had the high ground. The fear was that America stood at risk of being overrun by yet another totalitarian closed society. This was the cultural context that Sputnik brought to a focal point, and so it was different from the current characterization that China is now presenting the United States with an economic Sputnik moment. The little orb focused the amorphous sphere and placed the entire country in danger, at least psychologically. Broad debates have been swirling since the 1949 Soviet nuclear test about the need to invest more in education, particularly in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, often referred to as simply STEM, because of their cultural importance to national defense, but they foundered on the shoals of congressional indifference, much as they are today. Now those debates came into sharp focus, as historian Joanne Brown put it. The struggle for federal aid may have been won in the sky, but it was fought in the basements, classrooms, and auditoriums, as educators adapted schools to the national security threat of atomic warfare and claimed a proportionate federal reward for their trouble. Within a year, the National Defense Education Act of 1958 was passed, with the goals of improving education in defense-related subjects at all grade levels and bolstering Americans' ability to pursue higher education, and science would become a major issue on the presidential campaign trail in 1960. If we didn't recommit to science and technology, we might lose the Cold War. Our entire way of life, perhaps our very survival, was now at stake, and it all hinged on what we could do to protect ourselves by reinvesting in science and technology to catch up to and then resoundingly beat those damn Ruskies. The NSF's budget, which had been quite low, jumped dramatically in 1957 and continued to grow. American public opinion, which had been one of great moral ambivalence about science for 12 years since the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, began a new relationship with it almost overnight. Scientists might be sons of bitches, but they were our sons of bitches. Give me shelter. At the same time that the federal government was promoting duck and cover and transforming on an unprecedented scale how and where we lived and traveled, the Office of Civil and Defense Mobilization, OCDM, was broadly distributing public service pamphlets whose intent was to instill in everyone a sustained alertness to danger, the better to prepare in the country to survive the first wave of a nuclear attack. Those pamphlets were bundled with vinyl record albums of recorded survival instructions, such as the below from Topps Records. Our best life insurance may be summed up in 4 words. Be alert, stay alert. This will take some doing on your part. It will take ingenuity, it will take fervor, it will take the desire to survive. There is no doubt about it, if you live within a few miles of where one of these bombs strike, you'll die. It may be a slow and lingering death, but it would be equally as final as the death from the bomb blast itself. You'll die, unless you have shelter. Shelter from the intense heat, and the radiation that is the byproducts of a nuclear explosion. Let's assume bombs fall before you have time to prepare shelter, or while you wait, in the belief atomic war will never come. We can always hope that man will never use such a weapon, but we should also adopt the Boy Scout slogan, be prepared. It may be safe for you to leave your house after a few hours, or it may be as long as 2 weeks, or more. 2 weeks with very little food or water, tension, unaccustomed closeness. 2 weeks with sanitary facilities most likely not operating. No lights, no phone, just terror. Fallout shelters were built around the country. New commercial buildings had them. New homes had them, and residents stocked them with water, canned goods, candles, blankets, and tranquilizers. Public buildings had them installed. The possibility of sudden nuclear annihilation at the hands of the evil communists became part of everyday life, and many families rehearsed and planned for living for extended periods in dark and rancid basement shelters, and for being separated from one another indefinitely if an attack came when the children were in school. Some schools distributed metal dog tags similar to those worn by soldiers so that the burned bodies of students could be identified in the days and weeks after a nuclear attack. What grief and what horrors science had brought upon us. Our most precious new baby boom of children was growing up in a climate of terror, when science walked out on politics. By this time it was clear that science was the answer to the twin threats of the arms race and Sputnik, and that America was in fact a science race, as Vannevar Bush had essentially argued in his report Science, the Endless Frontier. Science had become one of the primary weapons in a new kind of war. The nation that invested the most in science and engineering research and development would lead the world. Science had in the span of 2 short decades attained a sacred cow status enjoyed by few other federal priorities. Gone were the days of scientists needing to reach out to wealthy benefactors to justify and explain their work. The adoption of science as a national strategic priority changed the relationship between science and the public. Over the course of a single generation, government funding allowed scientists to turn inward, away from the public and to their lab benches. But this relationship came with the conflicting emotions of need and resentment. Though their work is by nature anti-authoritarian, scientists became figures of authority in white lab coats, bland, dry, value-neutral, and above the fray. This new image of science, implanted in baby boomers by hundreds of classroom film strips, couldn't have been less inspiring or further from the truth. By their nature, scientists are very often intensely passionate and curious, and these are the very qualities that typically motivate their interest in science, the exploration of creation, to begin with. But very little of that characteristic passion and curiosity would be communicated to the general public for the next 50 years. Science became the other culture of quietly cloistered intellectual monks. With tax money pouring in from a vastly expanding economy and the public respect afforded the iconic authority of the white lab coat, 2 generations of scientists instead had to impress their own university departments and government-granting agencies to keep research funds coming their way, but they no longer had to impress the public. At the same time, science was becoming less accessible even to other scientists. As research became increasingly specialized, no one could keep up on all the latest findings. There was simply too much information. With scientists not being able to follow each other outside their own fields, reaching out to the public seemed a hopeless exercise. What mattered was not process, but results. University tenure tracks rewarded the scientists who had successful research programs and multiple professional publications, but gave no similar consideration to great science communication or public outreach. Those who can, do, the attitude of scientists became, and those who can't, teach. It was a horrible mistake. Locked in the subculture of competitive, smart, and passionate people focused on their own research, on doing, scientists seemed to forget that they were responsible to, indeed part of, the community of taxpayers that funded much of their work and so deserved a say in what they did, or at least, to be sold. Scientists as a group became notoriously cheap donors of both time and money and withdrew from civic life in other ways. Giving back and participating in the greater civic dialogue just wasn't part of their culture. And as in any cloistered society, attitudes of superiority developed within the science community, attitudes that ran counter to the fundamental anti-authoritarian nature of scientific inquiry. Many scientists came to view politics as something dirty and beneath them. Arguing that they did not want to risk their objectivity, they eschewed voicing opinions on political issues. So while science was entering its most dizzyingly productive and politically relevant period yet, very little of this creativity was relayed to the public. Only the results were publicized. From the public's perspective, the science community had largely withdrawn into its ivory tower and gone silent. This proved to be a disaster. Public sentiment is everything. American democracy is often confounded by the mistaken idea that politics is the lowly part of the business, what you have to put up with in order to enact policy, but in fact, the opposite is true. This mistake is made especially often by scientists who view politics as dirty. Abraham Lincoln eloquently illustrated this point when he debated his opponent Stephen Douglas in the 1858 Illinois campaign for the U.S. Senate. Lincoln lost that election, but he forced Douglas to explain his position on slavery in a way that alienated the Southern Democrats. That set Lincoln up to defeat him in the race for president 2 years later. Public sentiment, Lincoln said, is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. Consequently, he who molds public sentiment goes deeper than he who enacts statutes or pronounces decisions. He makes statutes and decisions possible, or impossible, to be executed. Thus politics, which moves the invisible hand of democracy, is more important than policy. It reflects and shapes the will of the people. It is the foundation on which policy is based. Lincoln's thinking in this regard echoed that of Thomas Jefferson. Scientists were certainly smart enough to realize this, but the structure that was put in place under Vannevar Bush's grand vision worked against it, for who now had to worry about shaping public sentiment? As president of the Carnegie Institute of Washington, Bush was very familiar with all the time and resources that fundraising required, and his goal was to lift the onus of obtaining research funding off of scientists and universities to propel the nation forward in a more coordinated way. But the need to sell the worth of one's works to the public and donors, to converse about new discoveries and their meaning, and to inspire and excite lay people may be the only thing that keeps the public invested and supportive in the long term. Bush may have done the job too well. The shift to public funding changed the incentive structure in science. This might not have been a problem if scientists had valued public outreach, but by and large they didn't. As economists are quick to point out, people often adjust their behavior to maximize the benefits of themselves in any given transaction, and the economics of the new science structure rewarded research, but not public outreach or engagement. As a result, most scientists ignored it, and science coasted off the largesse of the taxpayers' fear of the Soviets. The two cultures. The growing divide between science and mainstream culture was happening in England too, and the situation in both countries was famously articulated by British physicist, novelist, and science advisor C.P. Snow, a man who straddled both worlds like the scientists of old had, and who warned in a famous 1959 lecture titled Two Cultures in the Scientific Revolution that the widening communication gulf between the sciences and the humanities threatened the ability of Western peoples to solve their problems. A good many times I've been present at gatherings of people who, by the standards of the traditional culture, are thought highly educated, and who have, with considerable gusto, been expressing their incredulity at the illiteracy of scientists. Once or twice I've been provoked and have asked the company how many of them could describe the second law of thermodynamics. The response was cold. It was also negative. Yet I was asking something which is about the scientific equivalent of, have you read a work of Shakespeare's? I now believe that if I had asked an even simpler question such as, what do you mean by mass or acceleration, which is the scientific equivalent of saying, can you read? Not more than 1 in 10 of the highly educated would have felt that I was speaking in the same language. So the great edifice of modern physics goes up, and the majority of the cleverest people in the Western world have about as much insight into it as their Neolithic ancestors would have had. Scientists didn't see this as a warning or an invitation to reach out. Rather, they viewed it by and large as a criticism of the willful ignorance and snobbishness of those practicing the humanities. To a certain extent, their view was justified. Intellectuals weren't giving their work its due. The fast-growing importance of the sciences was garnering scientists considerable funding and public regard in exchange for the new powers and freedoms they were giving society. Yet, that same society's highbrows still refused to acknowledge their work's significance. But life in survival mode, as the Soviet menace necessitated, made what could save us the priority and relegated other important things to the status of luxuries. Suddenly we didn't have the luxury of indulging wonder or the humanities to the extent we once had. And science had adeptly proven its utility to society, as Snow argued. Although he criticized scientists who would scarcely make their way through Dickens without any understanding of its subtleties, he saved his harshest criticism for British universities, which had underfunded the sciences to the benefit of the humanities, despite the former's contributions, and for the snobbishness of literary intellectuals. If the scientists have the future in their bones, he said, then the traditional culture responds by wishing the future did not exist. It was a statement that could just as easily describe the U.S. Congress some 50 years later. The lecture was printed in book form and widely debated in the United States as well as Britain. It had been declared one of the 100 most influential Western books in the last half of the 20th century. Snow envisioned a third culture emerging of people schooled in both the sciences and the humanities, but that is not what took place. A great change had begun in Western universities, and humanities professors felt themselves inexorably slipping from the top spots and being supplanted by scientists, who generally seemed like they couldn't have cared less about the humanities. Why bother with all the reading and writing and talking when science was actually doing things? But this was equally short-sighted, and in the shift we let go of something precious, our grasp on the classics that had informed Western culture. Since scientists couldn't be bothered with civics, democracy continued to draw its elected leaders primarily from the humanities, and so we were also creating a culture war that is with us to this day, threatening the ability of Western democracies to solve their problems, just as Snow feared. The scientific technological elite. Democracy is, as we now know, rooted in science knowledge and the biology of natural law that is at the base of our legal framework. But most of our elected leaders have not had significant training in science, or in how the ideas rooting law and democracy relate to science. In the middle years of the 20th century, this was beginning to pose a problem. The twin threads of fear and resentment created a growing sense that science might be outpacing the ability of a democracy to govern itself. The situation was alarming enough that it compelled President Eisenhower to warn the American people about it. On January 17th, 1961, in his farewell address to the nation, he famously warned of the dangers of the emerging military-industrial complex. Ike blames the growing funding of science by the federal government as the primary cause of the rising behemoth, and complained that the solitary inventor was being overshadowed by teams of scientists in cloistered labs, hidden from the watchful eye of the public and awash in taxpayer money. In holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, Ike warns, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite. How far we had come from the days of the first State of the Union address, when George Washington told Congress that there is nothing which can better deserve your patronage than the promotion of science and literature. The very possibility of democracy had been created by a scientific technological elite that had included Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Benjamin Rush, and other founding fathers. Elitism had been something to aspire to. Now it was something to be feared. That's the end of Chapter 5. Next week we will continue with Chapter 6, Science, Drugs, and Rock and Roll.